Okay, so welcome to Series 1 for NGO Intel podcast. And for this series, we're going to be joined by Christian Plowman. Christian provides ad hoc consultancy and advice for our group NGO Intel and has been working full-time in the conservation NGO sector for 10 years. Prior to that, he worked in law enforcement and in various investigation and intel roles. So welcome to you, Christian.
Thank you, James. A pleasure to be here.
Lovely stuff. So for episode 1, what we're going to be focused on is looking at intelligence for NGOs. And the title of episode 1 is going to be, what is intelligent intelligence? So intelligence has many definitions for each organization or government across the world. And it's very hard to decide and hang our hat on one targeted definition. Here's one that I've pulled out, which is going to help frame this discussion on what we're going to do today. So, intelligence is useful information gathered and analysed from various sources that help shape decisions regarding national security, interests and threats. It involves the collection, evaluation and interpretation of information to become actionable intelligence. So, as suggested, we're going to focus on today's podcast on what intelligence means to NGOs. And what is this intelligent intelligence? So the first question that I'm going to pose to you, Christian, is your work involves turning complex data into actionable insights for NGOs. So can you provide us an example of a time when a piece of intelligence, which might have been overlooked by traditional law enforcement, provided or proved to be critical for the NGO's mission?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are numerous examples throughout the past 10 years that I've been working with NGOs. I think it's fairly fundamental to understand from an NGO perspective that they have the capability of acquiring significant amounts of information by virtue of their work, whether that's purposefully collecting information or not. But they do amass a fair amount of data, and it makes a lot of noise, I suppose. It's very difficult to extrapolate relevant things from that information. So, I mean, one of the things that is crucial for an NGO to understand and to do is to be able to pinpoint those small or seemingly irrelevant pieces of information that can then be developed and create an understanding of a bigger picture. We were recently looking at an online wildlife trafficking case. And I think it's very normal for NGOs and other agencies, law enforcement agencies, to focus on sort of very big or high profile cases. But we were able to look at what appeared to be seemingly a very minor online wildlife trader. And we devoted a fair amount of time and resources looking at open source intelligence and social media intelligence. And just spending time looking at this seemingly minor link in the chain allowed us to gather information which gave us this really nice overview of their network, effectively, supply chains, facilitators, and I have to say some corrupt officials who were involved in facilitating movement through ports or across borders. So it wasn't just we weren't just pulling out data. It was a strategic insight, or it was information that we developed into a strategic insight. And it's having that capability to pinpoint, gather, evaluate, and analyze that puts you in a position to have that information and turn it into actionable intelligence. It's a phrase that's bandied about quite a lot, certainly within the sort of civil society or NGO sector. It's possibly one of those phrases that might be a bit misunderstood, but that example is precisely what we're talking about, is, swimming through the noise, finding the relevant bits, developing that information into a package or a product that people, ideally law enforcement or other government agencies, are able to act upon. It's finding those sort of critical leverage points so that some sort of action or intervention might be taken.
Okay, Thanks for that. Now, I'll probably come on to a point in a little while just about social media intelligence and the benefits of that. You mentioned about, this phrase of cutting through the noise, and I think this leads on to the next question. The term intelligent intelligence suggests this qualitative difference, not just more data. So, look, how do you differentiate between more information collection and then the strategic intelligence that empowers an NGO, especially when, a lot of the NGOs are under-resourced, funding's being cut. How do you deal with this more data and these less resources and still make a difference?
Yeah, this is a critical question and really important for us to have an understanding of the NGO context. You quite rightly said there are often resourcing issues. NGOs, particularly in the conservation and humanitarian sector, are reliant upon particular funding streams to achieve particular objectives or have an impact. So you have to take that into account. I think the difference in the NGO world and the law enforcement world or the intelligence world is the capability to evaluate the information or data that they collect. As I said earlier, NGOs can amass a huge amount of data. Most NGOs, particularly in the conservation sector, are very eminently academic, and there's often a sort of probably a bit of dissonance between the academic concept of data gathering and research and the things that we might be more familiar with around intelligence gathering and evidence gathering, and intelligence analysis and evaluation. And sometimes there's a bit of a sort of bit of dissonance between the two, a bit of misunderstanding. So it's really important to take that into account as well, to understand that NGO stroke academic context that NGO personnel might be much more familiar with. However, aside from that, they amass a lot of data, and it's important to be able to focus on turning it into this decision-making advantage for under-resourced NGOs. So intelligent intelligence has to be contextual. That's really important. It has to be tailored because NGOs don't have the either capacity, resources, or time, or intention, perhaps, to be able to trawl through loads and loads of data and to find out, to pick out points which are relevant or impactful for their mission. It's not, we're not looking at a big dump of data. It's a tailored, contextual product, a briefing that says, right, this is the risk, this is the opportunity, and here are some potential courses of action. It's got to be that tailored and that specific, because otherwise NGOs who are, as we've said, often operating in very difficult environments, under difficult conditions, under-resourced, etc., they're not going to be in a position to make those critical decisions that will move their mission forward. And that has, longer term impacts both for their reputation, their credibility, and, let's face it, future funding potential.
Okay, thanks. So we've spoken about, in effect, what actionable intelligence is, and we've spoken about the large mass of gathering intelligence, or the data, the information. So if we just take a step back now to looking at those techniques, you've got experience in open source intelligence, the human intel, which is, speaking to the resources on the ground, or training those resources to gather that data and that intel. And also the more analytical and strategic view of monitoring these trafficking networks. So how should an NGO balance the need for sophisticated intelligence gathering, like some of these techniques we're talking about? We're not just looking on the internet here, we're actually getting down and speaking with some of these sources. And what are going to be those ethical considerations and the potential risks to those, particularly those sources that are on the ground working in quite some of these volatile and high risk locations?
Yeah, these are, again, really, really important questions for NGOs to pose for themselves. And, it's something that I've advised on in innumerable situations, particularly around that sort of field-based human intelligence gathering. So, I mean, again, I hark back to what I said earlier about NGOs often having a very fundamental scientific or academic basis for their work that they undertake on the ground. And I've always found it somewhat ironic that, for example, to conduct academic research in the field, which involves human subjects, so something as simple as a survey, there are really rigorous ethical considerations, concepts like do no harm, and free prior informed consent. Things like that are required to undertake this sort of activity from an academic perspective. And yet, when NGOs undertake or get involved in things like intelligence gathering or information gathering around criminality and crime, particularly, for example, wildlife trafficking or human trafficking, those ethical considerations are very often not considered. And for me, the basis of conducting that sort of activity and the ethics around it, I will always say that, as far as I'm concerned, the UK has the sort of highest standards, the gold standard in relation to intelligence gathering, human source management, human source gathering, intelligence gathering, through the legislation that exists, and the legislation that has existed in the past. And I think using those standards as a basis for NGOs to consider the ethics and safety around what sort of activities they're conducting is really, really important. I mean, it's very, very complex, as anyone who's been involved in that sort of world knows. It seems to be a very onerous task to consider all of the ethical ramifications around things like entrapment or agent provocateur when you are conducting these sorts of intelligence gathering exercises. But it's crucial because it could, and it has, for some NGOs, caused huge reputational damage, and damage to their credibility. And it's not something that any NGO worth their salt would want on their plate, to be honest with you. So it's important to have a framework, a structure, support, training, guidance, and I mean proper training and guidance around conducting that sort of work, especially in the field. You need to make sure that all of your field activities are risk assessed appropriately, and that you consider things like invasion of privacy, right to a fair trial, right to life, all of those fundamental human rights, which, whilst I speak from a UK perspective, are applicable in every jurisdiction globally. So there's not really a sort of legislative or jurisdictional dilemma there, because these are fundamental ethical and moral aspects that we should be considering. And we do the same with our online, our online work, our online intelligence gathering. They're subject to very, very similar sort of justification and necessity assessments, so that we can justify why we're doing what we're doing. We speak about a lot about digital security, so cyber security, and the hygiene or tradecraft that we might practice whilst we're conducting intelligence gathering online. All of this is, as far as I'm concerned, fundamental, but is often a subject, because of its complexity, I think, a subject that's either overlooked or just put to one side in many contexts. But it's crucial, and it affects the quality of the intelligence that you ultimately generate, and it affects the credibility of the product that you ultimately generate as well.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for that. In one of your previous answers, you spoke about contextualization and a tailored approach. And this leads on to the next question. So, considering you've had extensive experience in Africa and Southeast Asia, how does that definition of intelligence change based upon the operational regions? So if we're looking at a particular threat with wildlife versus human trafficking and the local partners involved, jurisdictionally, is it a one size fits all, or how do you adopt from something in, say, in Malawi to something in Vietnam?
Mm.
What are those
Yeah,
differences there?
yeah. Again, again, a really good question and something really important to consider. There is no one size fits all option, and there can't be a one size fits all option. I mean, you often get involved in conversations or discussions where people will make very sweeping generalizations. For example, they will speak about Africa or Southeast Asia. And as we both know, you cannot apply the same context or the same requirements to those huge regions. And even when you drill down even further, I mean, in my experience in Africa, there are tailored solutions that are required within small regions of countries. You have to drill down, to the nth degree to make sure that your approach is appropriately tailored to that particular local context. There might be parts of protected areas or national parks which require a slightly different approach or a slightly different intervention. Not all interventions will work in all places. For example, there are differing degrees of success, for example, that you can have with criminal justice interventions in different regions or different countries. And that's for lots of different reasons. But nonetheless, it's important to understand that context so that whatever assistance, guidance, whatever product that you want to generate, or what impacts you want to have is appropriate for that particular region. I mean, if you look at the online wildlife trade, for example, there are huge differences between how that trade is conducted in Southeast Asia to how it's conducted or managed in Central Africa or Europe, for example. It's a vast difference. And so therefore, the way in which you manage that problem or try and intervene or generate information is going to be incredibly different. So, a deep dive into the local context is necessary. You need to understand really basic stuff that again is sometimes overlooked. What technology is available, what's the network infrastructure, what are the preferred ways of communication, what are the preferred ways of making payments for illicit trade, for example, the culture, the political landscape. There has to be an assurance that the intelligence that is provided or the product that is provided is accurate, that it's, and also that it's culturally relevant and operationally relevant. I think there's a tendency very often to take these off the peg solutions and apply them to every single context, and it doesn't work. And that's really very true for law enforcement agencies, for example, like supporting them or delivering capacity building. Competencies and capabilities and resources are going to be very, very different in different countries, different regions, and with different agencies. So that's, again, something else that needs to be taken into account.
Okay, lovely. Thanks for that comprehensive overview. And I think, there's some interesting points there, which I'm going to recap after this this penultimate question here. We talk about this word, this grey area, and sometimes with NGOs, we find that they can operate within this grey area between, humanitarian aid and this quasi-local law enforcement. And as we both know, coming from a background in law enforcement and what exists within the UK, you're treading that fine line a lot of the time when you're working in covert operations or you're working within intelligence. You've spoken about this framework also, and around legislation. And you know, as we know from the UK, the Regulatory of Investigatory Powers Act of 2000 gives quite a very good, clear legislation, and there's clear case law and framework that sits around how intelligence is sourced and gathered, especially human intel, which is one of the, you know, the most high risk, difficult areas. So coming on to that point, how do you ensure the intelligence you develop is not only actionable, but it's also for the appropriate for the NGO to act upon it without overstepping that mandate? Because I think that is that fine line, that grey area that you have to tread. And I think that will be particularly difficult for NGOs to understand that sometimes if they're new to this or developing in new regions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I mean, one of the first rules, I suppose, and I've made this very clear in various, you know, manuals and SOPs that I've contributed to, is the understanding of the fact that you are an NGO. You are not a law enforcement agency, and you need to be in a position where you understand that, but you equally need to be in a position where you're operating lawfully within the region where you're working. Because once you know, if you're undertaking activities which are either unlawful or do not have the support or backing of the relevant government or state agency, quite frankly, you're on a hiding to nothing. Because ultimately, for me, the risk is far, far, far too high there, not only organisationally or reputationally, but from the perspective of personnel as well. So, I mean, one of the things that I've always ensured is that there is some sort of mandate in place that allows the NGO to, I mean, it can be something very ambiguous, quite honestly, but as long as there is some sort of mandate, an agreement with a state agency or a government agency that allows that NGO to be operating in that country and to be undertaking some form of, for example, counter wildlife trafficking activity, then that's a good and fundamental and essential starting point. And I think it's important to then understand from the NGO perspective, what do they want to achieve by virtue of this activity? And this all forms part of that framework that I spoke about earlier, this proportionality, legality, accountability, necessity structure that we might apply to understand what the objectives are, and how it is best to achieve those objectives. And is, for example, developing a human source network, is that the most appropriate way to achieve those objectives, or is there an easier way to do it? Can we look at doing it in some other way? It's not always about, yeah, let's pick the most glamorous, cool way of doing things, because often there are easier solutions which are less resource intensive, less expensive, and much less risky. And I think that is something that is often not necessarily considered. So, you know, you have to make sure that you identify those objectives. And in the intelligence world, as you know, James, this would be our intelligence requirement. It would be sitting at the very top of our intelligence cycle. So we make sure that those intelligence requirements are aligned with the NGO objectives for that particular project or that particular activity. And then after the intelligence is collected or the information is gathered, we're not just going to give over raw data. There's an evaluation and analysis process. And it means that as a result of providing that product to the NGO, there is some level of how can I explain? There's some level of evaluation and recommendation for that particular NGO. So it's contextual. It's specifically designed to fit within their objectives for that particular project, and it takes into account the fact that they are an NGO. They are not a law enforcement agency. I mean, on numerous occasions, I've seen very good intelligence generated, intelligence being evaluated and analysed, and then it just sits there because nobody really knows what to do with it, because nobody has said, right, here are three choices, here are three options that you can take to develop this information or to get something done in order to achieve your objective or in order to satisfy your intelligence requirement. Again, it all comes down to context and understanding of that NGO situation and NGO mindset.
Okay, lovely. Thanks. Just going back to your first question where you were talking about the case study of the online wildlife trafficking case. You talk about social media intelligence, and this is probably just a last question, but from a social media intelligence perspective, how from a very operational and just an understanding view, how would that help in an online wildlife trafficking case?
I think
Is it looking at the network? Is it looking at their, say, from a Facebook perspective? Is that what you were, maybe who they're connected to? Were they using it as a marketplace? What's the angle of how you feel that would advance the case? Maybe not in that case, but in some cases, how you
in some cases, and again, it's contextual by region, location, etc. But absolutely, there are the utility of evaluating social media connections is quite incredible, to be honest with you. And it's a really good way of defining a network, potentially identifying some, key actors within that network. It's not the panacea, don't get me wrong. You're not going to get all of the answers by looking at somebody's Facebook connections or Instagram connections or posts, but it is very useful. What it does do, regardless of the actual sort of fine grain information that you can get in relation to associates and connections, what it does do, and this is something that we're both familiar with in that sort of covert enforcement world, is it helps build up this picture, helps build up a picture of an individual. It helps build up a picture of their behavior, what we might have called back in the day a pattern of life, but their online sort of pattern of life. And all of this, whilst it is not necessarily evidential, it all helps us to understand an individual and therefore how they behave and their network, and what they might be involved in or what they might be interested in. These are all really useful pieces of information that later on down the line, if we're talking about a long-term development operation, these are things that are going to come in handy when, for example, you might be looking at deploying some sort of covert asset to tackle that network or to tackle that problem. So the utility of it cannot be overstated, but it's a lot more than just extrapolating details of individuals and putting them on an association chart or a map. Um, what lots of people fail to realise, and I've fallen into this trap myself many times, is that the more intelligence you generate, the more you are then required to dig down. It's like a never-ending spiral, effectively, and it's quite easy to get lost in this sort of maelstrom of associations and deeper dives into associates and other individuals. But yeah, I mean, one of the things that has surprised me about, for example, the online wildlife trade is the fact that it's so overt. It's not something that's hidden. It's not like the drugs trade, for example, which has sort of slipped into the dark web and using encrypted messaging services and stuff like that. The illegal wildlife trade is conducted overtly online. It's very, very easy to go online now and find illegally traded wildlife. And sometimes I do worry that ultimately because of the nature of the efforts being taken to combat that trade online, that it might ultimately sort of go underground, as it were, out of necessity, perhaps. But it's surprising how useful that social media intelligence can be, and it has helped out on numerous occasions. It's given us some really key insights into networks and individuals and things like locations and behaviour.
Wonderful. Thanks for that. So to really recap on some key takeaways, some notes I've written here is, to be intelligent with intelligence, we've got to have this tailored local approach. We've got to have a deep dive into that. But sitting there as the backbone, there's a framework, that we must adhere to. I think we can apply best practice from other countries, other jurisdictions, apply that into a local approach. But what we shouldn't do is say, just because it worked in Kenya or Malawi, it's going to work in South Africa or Vietnam or the Philippines.
Yeah.
These are very, very different locations culturally, environmentally, and for many reasons, there is not going to be a one size fits all. We've spoken about the massive data, and the more data we've got, and we'll come on to the social media in a little moment, and because that's so important. But there's massive data, and in building a network analysis, we can go down rabbit holes, and we can start going down these constant rabbit holes and moving away from what we need to what the information, or adhering to the intelligence objective about what we've set out to achieve. So we need to be strategic, and we need to be very targeted about what we want. In one of the questions, we spoke about techniques, and you mentioned about training in technology. And I think if we take on this crisis views, when you look at a crisis, a lot of the times you're looking at human organizational or technology, the hot phrase. And I think this is very prevalent in intelligence around risks and the ethical and legal challenges that exist there as well. It's going to be a human issue or risk. There's an organizational risk, okay, or legal issue, and there's a technology risk or issue around that, or anything that we're applying from a intel gathering perspective. And on your final point, we were talking about social media and the value of it providing context and lifestyle to those people. It's that lifestyle pattern and behaviors, which could understand what sort of car that they drive, or the sort of group of people that they hang around. Or it could even give you very targeted intelligence that they're on every Friday, they're in this location in a certain city. So look, I think there's so much to be said. There's this complex, there's this huge amount of data. And as one sort of final phrase of what key takeaway for us is, and I've highlighted some of them there. What do you think is the one thing that you would probably say what makes intelligence intelligent for us?
I think it's certainly from an NGO perspective, it is that very contextual understanding. A really good example is linked to what you just said around the massive data that allows us, for example, to understand how an individual is behaving and where they're going and that sort of thing. From an NGO perspective, and I'm not talking about what we might want to do as law enforcement practitioners, but from an NGO perspective, that's information, that's intelligence that can influence other types of NGO interventions. So, for example, identifying alternative livelihoods that might be implemented in a community as a result of the social media data that we've gathered or we've evaluated. It could also influence perhaps looking at alternative interventions, so non-criminal justice interventions, so things like education programs or sensitization to the laws or something like that. So there are so many opportunities, but that only works when you understand the context. And again, I have to underline that so much. I mean, even even applying something in northern Congo might be completely different to how it might work in southern Congo. That sort of context, that fine granular context, is really important to understand. So it's about context. Understanding the objectives or the intelligence requirement, the objectives and the desired impact. Without understanding those, then the intelligence is not intelligent, and it's not going to yield what we want it to yield, basically.
Lovely. Thanks for your time on that, Christian. And we'll see you on the next episode. Okay.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, James. Cheers.
Bye.